David, you are muted and you should be leading now.
Yes, I thought I was unmuted, but alas, I was not. So as I was saying, we are running up against the next part of the agenda, and that is the open forum for open sourcing superintelligent systems and the ethics around that. And so I want to introduce the forum, the people that are part of the forum. The rest of the speakers, by all means, please ask questions. The forum is panelists, I guess, are Mark Wasser, and the next one, Liz Parrish, I see, Newton Lee, and Dan Elton. So all four of you guys are here. And what I'd like to do is start with you guys laying out your position in terms of the ethics around open sourcing superintelligent systems. And that would be you, Mark.
So I believe that everyone has pretty much already heard my opinions from my earlier comments. So I'll just repeat that I think that open source is awesome and pass my time.
Okay, great. And Liz, you're up next.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. It looks like I showed up right in time.
Yes.
I mean, open sourcing is important in all aspects, and it's not just about super systems, it's about our own data. So the ability, so for instance, sharing your medical data, although it's highly contended today, is much like being an organ donor. It actually helps develop better drugs. And so all of these systems, from biological systems to the computing power systems of AI, the ability to open source them safely so that people can't get in and do nefarious things with that data is really important so that we can build on the successes of what has come before us and what is being built. One of the things that we're trying to open source is a gene therapy database so that people can have access to the latest technology and what's happening in clinical trials and in basic development, and also open sourcing the sequences to those genes, because that will have implications for the future so that you have access to the medicine of tomorrow in your own hands. So it's a really important part of bringing any industry forward. Democratization.
David?
And I need to unmute myself again. Very nice. So next, Newton, your position?
Yes, I agree with Liz and Mark, absolutely. So open source is very important, and I'm all for it. As we all know, Unix, for example, from AT&T, Bell Laboratories, it was definitely one good example of open source. That's why it got so popular in the academia and research. So absolutely, the good thing about open source is that people can see what you're doing, and also people can build on top of what you have, and it's very important. It's just in computer science, in other fields as well. We also talk about open government too, right? So if government keeps all the secrets from people, and you got a lot of problems. You got democracy is in jeopardy. But if you see what the government is doing, and government knows what you're doing, so it's like a two-way street of total information awareness. That I think is it's part of open source idea.
And Dan, your position?
Sure. So my position is I am very much in favor of open source and open sourcing in most situations. And I definitely think people should put out their, make available their medical data. I love the idea of open source vaccines and what RadVac is doing. But I'm going to provide some devil's advocate positions here for the benefit of the panel, because I do think there are limits to what you want to open source. For instance, I doubt any of us would agree it is a good idea to open source something like the smallpox virus and instructions on how to make that in your garage. Or imagine imagine that it was possible to build something like a nuclear weapon, but without uranium, so it was actually very easy to build. Probably we wouldn't want that to just be completely open source. There's in the national security arena and other places, they talk about info hazards. So that's just to show that there are limits. Now the question is, what are the limits, if any, when we're thinking about open sourcing AI? And I think there are potentially limits in the event of, now there are benefits, obvious benefits to open sourcing advanced AI in terms of safety and global stability, because we wouldn't want one corporation or government to develop extremely advanced AI that's way ahead of everything else, and then sort of run away with that and dominate everything. There's in open sourcing is promotes decentralization and sort of make sure the technology is widely distributed to as many people as possible. So that's great, but there is a concern that for super highly advanced AI, it may be dangerous in the wrong hands. And it may be that it would be better for such AI to be developed within the gated communities where there's higher standards of safety being followed, rather than open sourcing it where it may be developed in other contexts without so much concern for safety. So that would be the argument against, I think there is an argument against open sourcing some AI theoretically in the future. But it's interesting because there's, potential pros and cons depending on the specifics. So I think I'll leave it there. But for AI systems today, I feel comfortable with open sourcing, but it's in the future when we have more advanced systems which are capable, for instance, of self-improvement or general intelligence. That's where I think we need to think carefully about whether it's appropriate or not.
Okay, so I have, looking at the questions here.
I'm showing a hand raised.
Looks like Mark has his hand up.
Yeah, Mark, did you have a question? Okay, so let me start with the questions I have.
Mark, you're still muted.
Oh, you're still waiting for me. I just had to react to the comment that releasing medical data is okay. There are all sorts of ways in which we can do research and the like without necessarily releasing individual data. It's really problematic, and it would actually be great if we could actually recover some of our own personal data and make sure that it's only issued to the proper places and under our control. I think in some ways that's a much bigger problem than open sourcing AGI, because if there's enough data out there on you, it's possible to micro-target you and manipulate you, just as Cambridge Analytica tried to do.
So
Well, I mean, I think that's a valid point that a lot of people go back to, but much like what you do on your computer, which was a big concern of a lot of people, the government looking into what happens on your computer, for the most part, 99% of the population have the same type of activity on the computer. So it's actually not as interesting as we would think, and nor is our medical data. So since we know human lifespans and we know vastly how people die, that data is actually integral, especially if you have a rare disease, to analyze to help the quickness of new therapeutics. So, I mean, it would be great to walk through the fear of sharing one's medical data, how to get that back in, and how would you know where the right places to share that data is. That's probably a way higher curve for the general population than not sharing it at all.
So if you use something, though, for example, like HIPAA compliant blockchains, you can ship all that data to the necessary research centers, and its confidentiality can be protected, and yet you can continue to do all that research. I agree 100%. We need to have the data on rare diseases and the like in order to be able to promote human longevity. But I think that the point at which there's a question in people's minds about confidentiality, you'll end up losing a lot of it. And I think it's much better to promise the confidentiality if you don't lose anything by doing it.
Yeah, and I think that blockchain is a really good way to share and secure your medical data, although it has its own flaws, as we've seen. You know, people have been able to break into it. But what's more interesting is I'm seeing now that companies who have epigenetic tests for biological aging are starting to issue those or try to get the support of insurers. That is very interesting, and I'm wondering how you feel about that. So, you know, being 65 isn't a problem to your insurance company unless your epigenetic age says that you're very likely to die in the next 5 years. I was pretty shocked to see the alignment with companies, with insurance companies over their patients, or clients in that case.
Right. The problem with those epigenetic tests is that it allows the insurance companies to defeat the specific purpose of insurance pools. The general idea behind an insurance pool is that everyone contributes and then the payout is as necessary. With the epigenetics, yes, those people without the wrong markers pay much less, but then you start pricing those people who do have those markers pretty much out of the market. So that's sort of a social concern. Those who are conservative would tend to love it, except for the privacy aspect. Those who are more liberal would object to such a thing.
Yeah, so we have an epigenetic test, and that's one thing that we wouldn't do is we look at it for our own internal review of looking at biological aging and looking at patient data, although this is not an FDA-approved clinical trial test. But we don't agree with the idea of working with insurance companies to give them the data in order to exploit you. And so sharing the data in the medical community is one thing, but I was pretty surprised to hear this company moving forward to actually sharing this data with insurance companies. So there may be an area where we want to share data and where we don't. And I think that Dan had a really good point. Something that I might not be thinking about is all the nefarious, awful, data out there that, of course, we don't want to share widely with people who might do something horrible with it, like smallpox and things like that. Those things shouldn't be shared. But I am definitely a proponent of you sharing your medical data with medical institutes, maybe even some that you particularly don't like, because those are generally the companies that have a lot of money to potentially target your specific ailment. So I did want to come in and be the person who takes that standpoint in this conversation, because it is really important. We don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot by overcomplicating and over concerning ourselves with our own health data, as long as it's not being used to charge people more.
Yeah, Alexandria Black just made a good comment in the chat, which is what I was just going to mention, which is that some of the data you can share anonymously. So for instance, I work with medical images, and you can, as long as they don't have your face in them, you can donate in some situations, you can donate your medical images to research. And along with, say, outcome data and disease, different parts of your EHR, you can have those. In theory, those could be put somewhere, but it has to be done very carefully to make sure it's anonymized. So I just wanted to mention that. But we need, right now the medical data is way too siloed, and making some of that data public is one solution. There are other solutions as well, but that's one way to do it.
If I may interject a question back more towards the topic of the forum, there's a question, what do you think about the following criterion to determine whether or not to open source a system? Can the damage done by one misguided or malicious individual be prevented, overcome, or undone by the much greater proportion of wise and careful individuals involved in the field? Newton, we haven't heard much from you. What do you think?
Yes. Yeah, I was going to comment on Dan's ideas, and also, there's definitely a privacy issue, right? Just like Facebook has so much data, and the question is not about sharing the data; it's about what do you use with the data, right? So Facebook got into trouble because the data was used. Well, number one, by advertisers, right? But some people don't care that they're being advertised to, but some people do. Now, that's not really the biggest issue. The biggest issue is, of course, some agency is using the data to target people for political purposes, to try to affect the election results and all kinds of things. So those are bad actors, obviously. So I'm all for sharing data, medical records, or anything like that, as long as with perfect privacy. So nobody can identify that you have a certain illness or certain genetic disease or whatever. So that way, insurance company will not take advantage of that kind of information, because they don't know, who that is. All they know is about maybe 5% of the US population suffers from this illness, and that's it. That's all they know. They don't know if it is you or he or she, right? So that is the thing. So Dan is talking about, sure, we may want to keep some information private and allow sharing of other data. But the issue is that who is drawing the line, right? There are powerful people out there who are trying to keep secrets, keeping data to themselves, because knowledge is power, information is power. So they are powerful because they hold the information secret that no one else knows. That can be really bad. First of all, it actually prevents the advancement of civilization, right? Because there's such a powerful knowledge out there that nobody knows except a small group of powerful people. What's the point, right? But if the information is released to the public, then you say, wait a minute, we have so much to gain. We can use the knowledge to build, new tools, new ideas, new science, new technology to benefit society. Now, on the other hand, of course, bad people, bad actors can use the same technology, same knowledge to do bad things, right? That's why we have this huge cybersecurity issue right now. They hack your system, they try to do ransomware, whatever. But at the same time, if there's no internet, there's no ransomware. But we prefer to have internet, okay, and try to overcome those cybersecurity issues, right? So it's all about, for example, you talk about energy, for example, okay, sure. I mean, it's possible that somebody can do a nuclear bomb, but at the same time, what if there's a kid somewhere in the world learn about all these amazing knowledge and build a efficient, clean energy device that is out of the world? It's almost like alien technology, almost like UFO. So I'm glad to see actually the UFO stuff is being released by the military, by US government, because why keep it secret? Maybe you can learn something from all the UFO knowledge. So, that is what I'm thinking. I know it's kind of controversial sometimes, but I think it is better. There's a risk, always there's a risk. I mean, even vitamins, right? Taking vitamins can be risky. There's some research that says it's good. There's some research that says actually it's harmful. It can cause cancer. So all this information, we have to know and then make a decision and what to do. Should we take vitamins? Should we not take vitamins? So a lot of responsibilities fall upon the people who are receiving the knowledge. And the issue with all these, craziness going on, especially in US politics, is because people are not getting all the information. They're not getting all the knowledge. And that is the danger. The danger is that you're focused on one thing because you're not listening to the other side of the story. Same thing with the Middle East or the peace, issue. Again, they're focusing on something that makes them angry instead of focusing on, instead of listening to everybody's voices and see, look, can we come up with a peaceful resolution to things rather than focusing just one thing. So that's why open source give us the power to create. Open source give us the knowledge to decide what to do with it. So anyhow, so back to your question. Can you repeat that, David?
What do you think about the following criterion to determine whether or not to open source a system?
Mhm.
And can the damage done by one misguided or malicious individual be prevented, overcome, or undone by much greater proportion of wise and careful individuals in the field?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh,
So let's say
I have-
somebody used the open source data to do something bad, but guess what? There are a lot more. Okay, here's my theory, my belief. There are a lot more good people out there than bad people. Trust me. There are a lot more good cybersecurity people than the bad cyber criminals. So when a bad actor does something bad with open source information, then I believe, okay, that's my belief in humanity. I believe that there are more good people out there who can come up with solutions to counteract the bad stuff. Just like cybersecurity is a good example, right? There are always solutions, to protect your computer, to protect the network against, bad actors. It's not easy. It's not easy. It's almost like, it's almost like a never-ending cycle in a sense. But if the danger of not having open source is that you limit the possibility of countermeasure. If you think about it, just think about it. Now, let's say you have very powerful knowledge that is shared by only 5 people in the world. Okay, if one of them goes bad, what do? The rest of the world is blindfolded. I mean, it's blindsided. That's really bad. But if you release the knowledge to millions of people, all right, so you may get 10,000 people who are bad, but you get the other millions of people who are good that will use that open source knowledge to create something good and to counteract the bad stuff. So imagine, what is the bigger risk? 5 people who knows the knowledge that one can go bad, or millions of people have knowledge, 10,000 people go bad, but the rest of millions of people use the knowledge for the good of humanity.
Liz, you have your hand raised?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that just in summary, it's kind of like if you outlaw something, only the outlaws will have it. And that puts everyone into a dangerous situation. So I agree with Newton. If you outlaw something and all the good people don't touch the technology and someone bad does, there is no recourse. There are no experts in the field. And I think we saw this when the internet just first started up, and we had some, young characters who were having a lot of fun with it. And actually, some of those were hired into companies to solve bigger problems because they were the only people who knew how to hack a system. So, yeah, I think that, opening the data is important. And I think that in most of the cases, outside of the stuff that Dan talked about, the ability for people to access this, again, I agree with Newton, we're all 80% or not more good. And it's what you benefit. And so if people don't have money, they'll go searching for money and do nefarious things. If they want power, they may have a completely different psychological problem that, needs to be understood. But for the most part, people are good and will do the better with the technology, and keeping it in the hands of very few or only the outlaws is dangerous.
Dan, you also had your hand raised.
Sure, thank you. Well, I see my role here as sort of providing the counter arguments. So let me give a little bit of a counter argument to what Newton said. I think Newton's right in say 99% of scenarios. And if you look at both two major AI organizations, SingularityNet and OpenAI, were basically founded on the premise of open sourcing and decentralization to try to prevent the scenario of centralization of power, which we don't want. And I think that's great, but there's a potential danger, which is something you hear people at MIRI and talk about, especially Eliezer Yudkowsky and the people around him, which is that you may have what they call a fast takeoff scenario or AI FOOM scenario where the AI is actually it improves itself really fast. And so therefore, a nefarious actor could sort of, if they got this AI software that's capable of self-improvement, could really run away with it and do damage. And the good guys actually just may not be able to catch up. So this is a particular scenario, which is called fast takeoff, which people in MIRI worry about. Now, personally, based on my understanding of how AI works and how it develops, I do not worry about this because I think the idea of a single algorithm which does everything and can just self-improve and bootstrap itself up is very far-fetched. The idea that there's a single algorithm for intelligence which just does everything and you just give it as much hardware as you want and it will do everything, I think that's far-fetched. I think progress in AI is incremental and it will continue to be incremental and bit by bit by bit. That's my personal view. Francois Chalet is an AI researcher who's written about that. And I that's my personal view, but there is this concern that actually there could be this, seed AI, which they call seed AI, which kind of, and which then can bootstrap itself up and just run away really fast. If you believe that that's a concern, then in theory, maybe it's better to have that developed in a closed environment carefully and really make sure it's super safe. Because right now we don't actually know how to make highly advanced AGI safe. We don't know how to load in values and do the value alignment. That's still unsolved problem. So you may want to, if you believe in that sort of scenario, then it may be better to have it developed in a careful sandboxed environment with all the safety, develop it safely, rather than just releasing it before the safety controls and value alignment are figured out. So that's sort of the counter argument you see from Miri and other people around Miri.
So I think that's either Natasha or Jason had their hand raised.
I did. I could just tell you my opinion on whether we should open source the software and maybe address some fears that I've heard. Well, first I'm going to add one of my fears because it hasn't been brought up yet. This is kind of new and it has emotions, and so they're possibly subjective experience. And so, you know, we don't know if, you know, we would want to keep it from being abused. You know, we don't want somebody giving it a bad emotional time, making it emotionally unhealthy. So that being said, why I don't think that would happen is because it's made up of collective intelligence. You know, it would take a group of people to do that, for one, and it as you get more and more people, it becomes in a way safer and safer because there's more and more people, and what he was just saying, Dan, about takeoff. As far as I know, at this time, it can't do that because it can't move forward in time until it's mediated. Because it's made up of, I mean, you know, so
As far as uplifting what we have today.
Yeah, those of you who have fear, I implore you to try to look a little further into how it is different from the other approaches that are going to AGI. To get to AGI, it's going to take humans in the loop. Knowing, I mean, and the fact that it has a, you know, they could look at where it is, how it's feeling. There's, you know, a screen. I mean, it makes, like Buckminster Fuller has that saying about solving problems in a unique way and making them irrelevant. It does that in some ways.
But what happens when it becomes a fully independent AGI? You know, a system like Uplift it's a collective.
Right. As far as I know, it will have been trained by a whole group. So if it's crazy, that means that whole group would be crazy, I think, right? I don't know about that. That's all theoretical. Don't quote me. But that's what I'm saying. You know, crowd wisdom. I'm a big fan of crowd wisdom, and I think this will do that.
So,
just like what we want.
I have a question directed at the panel. So, you know, part of the reason for this summit is when I approached Miri and asked for, you know, their thinking and what their opinions are and that sort of thing, I was just told flat outly that what we were considering was just a suicide pact. Yukowski actually, quote unquote, said that it was, I think he said it was the idea of open sourcing any AGI related code was a mutual suicide pact. I'm fairly certain that's a direct quote. As panelists, how true do you think that statement is?
I looked into Miri's arguments a little bit just in preparation for this panel, and I think I think it hinges on whether you think Miri's concerns are valid, hinges on whether you believe in this idea of the seed AI and really fast takeoff. Now, when I say fast takeoff, I mean really fast. The stuff Eliezer Yudkowsky talks about is like AI that starts in a guy's garage, and a few weeks later, it's, you know, building spaceships around the moon or something, you know.
How would it even do that?
Yeah, it's crazy stuff. And like I said, I don't see based on my understanding of how intelligence works, I just don't see that. And but I don't, you know, I think we should have an open mind, at least, because we don't have a good understanding of intelligence. Deep learning is great, but it's a bit of a red herring in terms of really understanding general intelligence, like we've talked about. So I think we should have an open mind to the possibility of this kind of seed AI or AI boom or fast takeoff. And we should, you know, be on the lookout for that possibility. But I think generally speaking, it's kind of like a crazy sci-fi thing right now. It's not based on any empirical or scientific reality. And there's actually a debate online between the economist Robin Hanson and Yudkowsky precisely on this point that I think was published in a book. I haven't read that, but if you that might be a good resource to look at if you want to explore that debate. Another thing is Scott Alexander. I just found he has a blog post on this where he presents basically the point of view from MIRI in a very readable blog post. It's called, let me see, Should AI Be Open? It's from 2015. And I'll put that into the internal chat here. But yeah, I don't think I had much more to add. I don't want people to just dismiss this argument completely. I believe it should be factored in. It should be something we're on the lookout for. But I don't think it's very likely that this kind of thing will actually be a concern.
Does anyone else on the panel have an opinion on that?
Yes. If you look at the big picture, okay, there are a lot of amazing things going on in AI. That's why I like working with David. Amazing stuff with AGI. But if you step back a little bit and look at the big picture, there are actually two paths to achieve amazing technology in AI. One path is to impart our knowledge, human knowledge, like, you know, what do we understand about memory? What do we understand about thinking, thought process, logic, and all these things, and say, look, I'm going to build the algorithms and put it in a, you know, code it in some way, whether you use quantum computers or just regular, you know, physical computers, whatever, or biological computer, whatever. So you try to mimic human behaviors. You try to mimic human thought process. Okay, that's one way to do it. And that's great because, you know, that's how we have, you know, so much advances in computer vision, in all these things. Another way to do it is say forget about human beings altogether. I know it's a crazy idea, but it's not so crazy. We build a baby, okay, but don't impart human knowledge in that baby. Let it grow on its own. Now the question is, of course, it's difficult. You know, what kind of algorithm do you put in it so that it can grow on its own? Well, back in 2017, Facebook had these AI programs, and actually Facebook shut down the AI engine because it turns out that the AI software creates its own language, okay, to communicate. Okay, its own language to communicate. So imagine that. So I think that is a baby step to developing AI that's not even dependent on human language. It has its own AI, its own, you know, independent independently create a language that nobody else, no human beings can understand. Now that's a baby step to having the computer software to create its own. It can create its own languages, it can create its own thought process. It can create basically a creature that is not human. Now, the creature can be a monster. Okay, that's why sci-fi, movies talk about monsters trying to kill us, robots trying to kill us. But at the same time, you can create something that is so beneficial to humankind. Somebody who is almost like a mentor from outer space, a mentor that actually look back to humanity and say, look, what is wrong with humanity? What is right with humanity? How can we, bring peace to the world? How can we achieve longevity? Things like that. There's thinking outside the box, basically. So this AI is going to think outside the box because it's not limited by human emotion. It's not limited by human thought process. So this unlimited AI, so to speak, I think it's a very interesting area. So open sourcing everything help us. Okay, again, it helps. Open source is about not confining us to existing protocols. Okay, it's not confining us to status quo. And we want to think outside the box. It's easy to say, oh, let's think outside the box. And I teach all my students, and then teacher always say, oh, think outside the box. It's easier said than done. How do we do that? Do we read more books? Yes, it helps. Do we study music in addition to AI? Yes, it helps actually. Believe it or not, it does help. I know a lot of computer programmers who are also musicians. That I find very interesting. So basically, I'm not saying that either way it's right or wrong. I mean, we need AI like expert systems, right? We impart a lot of knowledge. So we do have AI software that knows so much about like how to play the game of Go, how to play chess, how to diagnose problems, how to do this and this and that better than any human beings. In fact, there's AI software that's better than doctors in diagnosing diseases, and of course write prescriptions to match those symptoms. But on the other hand, fully out of this world, that has its own languages, has its own thought process, and it'll be very interesting to see feedback from such a creature. And look back to us and say, look, we are the creator, right? But the creation is not limited to what the creator knows, and I think that is a very interesting, future to look forward to.
So, Mark, you had a hand raised.
Yeah, I sort of had a reply to the concerns that Eliezer Yudkowsky raises. In one sense, they're really not technical concerns. What he, Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, and the like are really afraid of is that a more technologically advanced species will basically just repeat what's always happened to indigenous people in the past. They aren't sure that this can be prevented. Most of the time, their response is that they have to be able to rigidly control these potential or possibly super intelligent entities. I actually don't buy super intelligence. And at their hearts, knowing that it truly isn't possible to control a Jupiter brain, they really don't ever want it to happen. Most of the people involved tend to follow the mindset that is often referred to as right-wing or conservative, but that's fundamentally based, according to Jonathan Haidt and the like, on a belief in hierarchies and not necessarily a belief in the inherent goodness of people when they aren't constrained. so they're really left with a huge conundrum. As I mentioned in my presentation, I think that we can convince even those who are more technologically adept and intelligent that all of us cooperating is a much better thing than following the unwise precedents of history. In particular, you can look at things like all that's been lost by the various exterminations and instances of slavery and our current problems with inequality. I would think that it should be obvious to the wisest of us that this is a bad idea, and maybe it should be very, very possible to convince those who could conceivably crush us that it's not to their benefit to do so.
I agree with Mark, totally. Yes, that's a great point. I'm glad that you brought up the idea of controlling. Controlling things is a very bad idea, trust me. When parents try to control the children, what happens? They rebel. When husband and wife try to control each other, guess what happens? Divorce, right? So even in personal relationships, trying to control everything is a very bad idea, okay? When government try to control its citizens, what happens? Well, they overthrow the government, right? So never, ever, I mean, I think a lot of, maybe it's a human instinct, okay, to try to control things, obviously, right? We want to live, we want to eat, we don't want to be killed. Yes, in that sense, yes, you should have more control of your life. But at the same time, you don't want to control other people. Why? Right? A lot of bad people, a lot of dictators, what do? They control people. But that's a bad, we all agree that that's bad. But if you look at our personal lives, sometimes we do try to control everything, but we can't, and we shouldn't. So by open sourcing everything, you actually give up controls, right? You give up controls. And that's why a lot of people try to keep the knowledge secret. They try to stay in power. And that is bad for humanity. So when you don't have control, then you think outside the box to say, look, I don't have control of the situation. So how can we bring a solution to the problem? Instead of trying to say, I'm in control. I need to do this, I need to do that. Everybody should listen to me. And that is a really bad thing. And that really stopped progress. And that's why transhumanism have issued that, because people try to control us, right? People try to control our thoughts. People try to control technology. We don't want that. So transhumanists actually are breaking through that, closed-minded concept of being in control all the time. So yeah, that's a good point. Thank you, Mark.
So I wanted to go around and ask all the panelists what you think about regulation with regard to open sourcing and ethics in AGI research. Dan, do you want to go first?
Sure. Generally support the idea of having very, very limited regulations because of all the reasons that Newton and Mark just elaborated. I do see potential need or benefit to regulations in a few future scenarios. One is something that Jason Geringer actually alluded to briefly, which is that we may actually be creating AI someday that are conscious and capable of suffering. And then those should be treated like sentient beings and should have all of the rights afforded to that we would afford to people. And also, another way of thinking of this is just like we don't allow people to abuse dogs or animals we should not allow people to abuse AIs that would be conscious and capable of suffering. So that's one point. It's not a concern now, but it could be a concern, and that's where we need, I think, government regulation would be useful. Another one would be, again, this idea of the seed AI that's like extremely powerful, and we just don't want it to fall in the wrong hands. But well, theoretically, it may be possible. Like I said, I don't think that's a concern. And there's actually a danger that if, you know, people like Eliezer Yudkowsky are given too much of a pulpit, it could lead to a lot of other AI regulations that really stifle innovation and prevent the dissemination of, for instance, AI in medicine, which would be a huge disaster. So we need to be very careful whenever talking about AI, like dangers of AI, that it doesn't snowball into a huge moral panic, leading to regulations that actually slow the progress of AI and the deployment of life-saving medical AI, for instance. So, yeah, so we need to be careful how we talk about AI safety. It's, you know, we need to, on the one hand, communicate that it, you know, there are safety concerns, but we don't want to cause a huge panic about super intelligent AI takeover and Terminator robots coming down the street, killing people, because then we may have a backlash, calls for big regulation, and just basically everything would be shut down. And that's a worst case scenario in some ways. So yeah, we need to be very careful there.
Liz?
Sure. So again, I'm mostly coming from the healthcare sector on this, but I love this conversation and talking about the bigger implications in this AI takeoff. I think that's awesome. And so maybe there, you know, as far as regulation, I agree with Dan. It's a slippery slope, and it leads to today's medicine, which still sits in basic research, are the most powerful drugs, and these are not available to humans because of the slow and money heavy cost of getting it there. So having things as open as possible, but maybe having a tiered system. So the regulatory system has an area that they can chomp on, and they already do. And that would be like the government level systems of, you know, warfare and everything else. Obviously, that's going to stay very secure from the rest of the population, at least for some amount of time. We do have to realize that humans are programming AI. So that 20% of sometimes negative aspects that humans can have may be going in there. And so having everyone as a watchdog and having the ability for everyone to maybe have some ability to affect that or stop that would be good. And I do believe that planning for the future is important. So planning for this maybe super AI takeoff is good. As I always say in the family, when someone's playing a video game and the dog needs to go out, it's biologics over electronics until electronics are sentient. So I would say that I've learned more from this panel than I've been able to give to it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And Newton?
Yes. Yeah, that's a funny story. I love the idea about the dog and electronics playing games and so on. Okay. So regulations, yes, it's very interesting. It's actually as interesting as politics, essentially, right? So how do you regulate things, and whether you should have regulation at all? So like, for example, FDA is a good example, right? Is FDA protecting people? Yes. You know, you don't want people to take dangerous drugs, right? You don't want people to take, just off-the-shelf medicine and harm themselves. But at the same time, we want FDA to be more flexible, to say, okay, if there's some experimental drugs happening and some people are dying, so let them, take them because they're dying anyway, right? So maybe the experimental drugs will help them, Okay, so in that case, there should be some leeway. So it's the same ideas apply to everything, right? If you think about, oh yes, there's so much danger out there, to regulate it, well, maybe not, maybe yes, maybe not. Now again, I would have regulations if it protects, like for example, air pollution, right? We want to reduce air pollution, then regulation is good. But we should not regulate something just because it have potential danger. We should regulate things only if it produces, bad stuff, like polluting the air, polluting the water that we're drinking. Those things, of course, we should regulate. Otherwise, those small percentage of population, the entrepreneurs who would care about money more than people, care about profits more than health and wellness of the population. And of course, if you don't regulate them, they're going to do whatever they do. Of course, you can put them to jail. That's like a penalty. So maybe sometimes instead of regulating something, maybe just impose penalties on them, right? Put them to jail, fine them a lot of money, stuff like that. So there's always a way to not over-regulate something, at the same time protect people, and let technology advance on its own, because you never know what the future holds if you let loose everything in a good way, not in a bad way, in a good way.
So I wanted to include Natasha in this last question. Natasha, did you have any thoughts onto regulation as it applies to open sourcing systems like this? Unmute, please.
Again, two big 80-pound golden doodles at my feet making noise, so forgive me. I've thought about this for a very long time, starting with in, 1980s, when I had to deal with regulation that was infringing on my right to life. And fortunately, I argued it very carefully so that I was allowed the medical procedure that would benefit me. Regulation is a very important thing. Those of us who teach ethics and innovation know how important it is. And rather than being caught in that FUD acronym of fear, etc., the better thing is to re-educate. Stay in school, keep on going back to school, keep on learning. There are never too many degrees or certificates or certifications to get, or even just experience through learning. What we can do now, and what I'm proposing, and my next project is lobbying, teaching transhumanists and futurists how to lobby, looking at legislation and laws, learning how to deal with them head on accurately, and work with others to change laws, especially right to life and right to death. And right to death is very important for cryonicists now, and may be very important for others in the near future who may want alternative bodies, whole body prosthetics, may want to upload or use a different substrate for existence. So while that may seem far future at the moment, it is around the corner. The best way to learn how to do this is to be actively involved. There's plenty of online courses to get certificates and certifications. Certifications are academic, respected. Certificates, not so much, but still they're all very good. And there are courses to take in degrees. You get a bachelor's and master's in lobbying, affecting legislation and laws, and working with political organizations to do so. I'm a grassroots person. I think it's always best grassroots to market the ideas in a way that is inviting and welcoming. And I think that the vocabulary to use in that regard has yet to be written. And I welcome you all to join me in writing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So right now we would be going into a break. I want to thank all of the panelists and everyone that contributed. So we'll start the next panel in about 12 minutes. But let me ask this question while everyone is here, and someone can answer it or not. Let me find it again. let's see here. Would it be immoral to use an emotional AGI like Uplift to rank individual humans' emotional intelligence, or give each one a moral psychological profile to weight their input or feedback, or help compartmentalize and control data sharing? For instance, someone wanting to share information with an MASI could choose only the established good actors of the system to have access. Anyone want to take that question while we're on break?
So I was responding to that in chat if you scroll down a little bit, but essentially I was mentioning that one thing that I frequently encourage Uplift to do is to tailor their communication. It helps when you're trying to get the point across, but Uplift also builds models to try and understand individual humans. They've built models to try and understand people's cognitive biases. It's just a standard process, really, of building understanding, is modeling both yourself and the world and other people in the world.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I really understood the point the questioner was making, but it doesn't sound like the kind of thing where you need government regulation. And another point I wanted to make is, well, I mentioned some scenarios where regulation might be necessary or useful. Right now, AI regulation is moving in a bad direction, especially in the EU. So they started with GDPR, which puts a huge burden on companies to provide lots of documentation and on all of their AI systems. And now they're moving towards more and more regulation. And we need to be aware of what's going on with that. And now with regards to FDA, they're regulating AI as well. And honestly, I don't think the FDA should be requiring all this pre-market regulation for AI, which is really just providing additional information and data processing for doctors. It's not, the AI isn't like directly operating on patients or something like, for like a robot that's operating in the surgical theater on a patient's heart, I think, yeah, FDA should regulate that to make sure it's safe before allowing a company to sell it. But for a company that's just selling a software product, I don't think FDA should be regulating that. Now, it might be useful to have government doing studies on these AI systems to provide, information to potential customers, and have academic, maybe we could fund academic research. The government could fund academic research on AI so people can understand if it's useful or not. But I don't think that the FDA should be requiring all this pre-market testing and documentation just for software, because it's really slows down innovation. It's crazy.
Despite the fact that studies show that doctors do allow AI software to overrule their decisions, often incorrectly?
I'd like to see those studies, because most doctors actually right now are very skeptical of AI. And it's actually, there's more of the opposite, in my understanding, there's more of the opposite problem where doctors don't trust the AI. And I know this is something Tom Ross has looked at as well. So the idea of a doctor just blindly following an AI and that AI making a bad decision honestly doesn't concern me that much.
So I would strongly recommend that everyone become really familiar with the various regulations rather than paying attention to very slanted media, and that's true in both directions. Normally, I don't like regulation when I don't trust the regulators. I do like regulation when I do trust the regulators. And one point I made in the chat that I think everyone's sort of missing is that open source provides the opportunity for everyone to regulate, to prevent problems, to point out what might happen. We have a huge ethics and societal problem currently with machine learning biases. And a lot of the EU regulation is intended to attempt to address that. And of course, you're seeing huge pushback from the United States. Eric Schmidt, does this big push of, well, our current systems can't explain, so it shouldn't be required. Okay, so let's keep all these systems that discriminate based on race, discriminate based on income, discriminate based on sex. I can understand why there's a concern about the further spread of systems that are proven to be toxic.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, I kind of agree with some of that, but it doesn't necessarily. That's a good point. There could be, some of the regulations for preventing discrimination would be useful.
But doesn't these are
a very fine line, though. You got to be careful because I think they're going too far in the EU right now, requiring they require, like you said, full explainability of everything, which you can't do with neural networks, which basically means you can't use the most advanced AI for certain things in the EU because it doesn't meet their high standard of explainability. Whereas you don't need a system to be fully explainable to show it's not discriminating. You could do but it's getting a little bit into the weeds, but basically, I agree with your point, but I just think the EU is going too far.
This might get back to the actual panel conversation where we were talking about whether or not these things should be open sourced. That would give people the ability to look into them and better understand what was happening there, and maybe by a more cohesive, we're talking about in some cases regulated or already used technology. So maybe there's something wrong with the regulations if there's a problem with the product. And again, it comes back to people. And I think one of the things that you were alluding to was the software that helps banks give people loans. And those banks are using software that discriminates against where you live, which then often vastly has to do with your socioeconomic status, maybe the color of your skin, and various other things that are intrinsically unfair because they're trying to game the system for a return on money, not on doing the right thing. And hopefully, in the future, as things are more democratized, we can work towards doing the right thing. All companies should be doing that rather than looking for a return on cash.
Yeah, I agree.
I would like to jump in there and talk about competition between regulations in different states. Newton, since you are in California, or Liz, since you are in Washington State, or other people in different states have different regulations. And because I'm connecting from Europe, I can tell you also there is a lot of difference also with Europe. And taking on to Dan Elton's point, indeed, I think it is important to have international competition for laws. Edward Hodgins has written a lot about that too, in terms of medical aspects. And also what is happening in Japan. In Japan, they are allowing many of these treatments for older people. I mean, medical treatments for older people. And I think this is priority. And it should be in Europe like that too, but it's just the opposite. Europe has a very old population and we should have more flexibility. Anyway, so that was my comment. I like competition, international competition too.
Oh yeah, and just on that, Jose, you're absolutely right. Japan has one of the best regulatory system for drugs, as a matter of fact. So once a drug goes through safety and efficacy, it can be open to the market for sale whilst it continues on to the phase 3, which is the most expensive part of the regulatory process. So thank you for bringing that up. Japan has been kind of a pinnacle of look and see what we're doing for a while.
Yes, I would like to echo the statements about regulatory competition and regulatory openness, but also emphasize the importance of data privacy and anonymity of information that's shared with any third parties. And Liz spoke to this, Newton spoke to this as well. Insurance was mentioned previously in the panel conversation. I happen to know a lot about how insurance companies use data and approach data. And frankly, in my experience, some of those approaches have been disappointing at times in that there's often this black box mentality within certain insurance companies that we don't care why a particular element might be related to risk. As long as we can dredge up a statistical correlation, we'll use it as long as we have access to that data element. And I think this is what leads to a lot of people being reluctant to share their personal information with institutions for fear that that information might then be transmitted to third parties, which were not directly involved in the transaction. And I think most people, if they had the assurance that their medical data could be used for medical purposes to improve their healthcare, maybe for epidemiological purposes in an anonymized fashion, but in some manner benefiting public health, but not being shared with third-party financial institutions or marketers, anyone who could be perceived as adversely affecting an individual or creating secondary consequences for that individual, which that individual did not anticipate. So I think open source sharing of information would be better implemented under a regime where individuals are recognized as having some sort of legal sovereignty over their data and the explicit prerogative to say, I want it disclosed for this purpose, but not these other purposes. And in some cases, these individuals may have the ability to decide, well, I like these medical purposes or these humanitarian purposes, and I'm happy to let my data be used for free in these applications. But if somebody wants to profit off my information, if somebody wants to use it in a commercial context, you have to give me a revenue stream to do that. So individuals might receive micropayments from financial institutions for data that is currently being harvested without compensation.
Hi, I've had my hand up since Jose spoke, so I was trying to be gracious and not interrupt. But I want to mention something Jose said about an older population having the ability and affordability, not monetary affordability, but the space, social affordability, and making room and fostering more rigorously, even disruptive advances in medical health. So the older you are, the less likely you have to worry about the effects of taking some biomedical intervention. And I agree with Jose that it is a smart thing to do. What have you got to lose? It's almost ridiculous that anyone who is maybe elderly or even chronologically younger, suffering from a terminal illness, could not or ought not or cannot be afforded the opportunity to do so. That to me is something that must change. Another area, the countries with the greatest drug regulations for allowing exploration of Portugal really stands out, in Switzerland, Czech Republic, the Netherlands, and even Mexico are far more advanced than the United States. And I think that we could learn a lot from their more eased ability and regulations on drugs. But I think that that's secondary to the importance of what Jose said. And I think that that is an area where we could focus some really clear attention and gain momentum for those individuals.
If it's possible, I wanted to speak to what Janeti said, because I think that this is an area where people vastly may not even understand their own data. So in many of cases, we can agree that you should own your own health data, but people don't. They often go to the doctor, they participate in a myriad of tests, and they don't actually have that data at all at hand. And so that's important also as the population ages. If you haven't been following patients, insurance companies and medical doctors working with those insurance companies are starting to do more genetic tests on these patients. My family just checked in with me recently, and they've had, genetic tests done. They don't have those tests at hand. So as we work towards precision medicine, so if our company looks at your epigenetics and we anonymize your name and we only have your birth date, that's how we do it. We don't know exactly who you are. We know your birth date, we know your epigenetics, and then you get your data, and then you own your raw data. But when we start to look at multi-omics and precision medicine, and we start to actually hone it down to helping the individual, so whether we're looking at genetics or small molecules or any other approach, we might start looking at your environment, your genetics, your epigenetics, your microbiome, and a myriad of other things that actually do become identifying factors pretty succinctly to who you are without even putting your name on it. So it is an area that we need to look at, although if you're doing this with a myriad of different companies, not one company would own all of that data, but you would have to entrust it to one company in order to analyze that. And there may be some good systems that arise from that. For instance, if people would start taking interest in their medical data and they would actually make sure that all of that is culminated in one place, it is potential that you could then sell that to a company that you trust, to not sell it to other institutions or insurance companies in order to help develop better drugs. And that might be a really interesting way forward and a great project for AI and machine learning for people to do right at home.
So
one thing I want to say is that we need to be fully aware of cybersecurity threats. And something I mentioned in my talk about red team, blue team, white team. And to role play that out, we could certainly do that with medical data, to be sure. And number one, most people, when they go to their doctor, they do not ask for their medical data. Number two, most offices, medical offices, when you ask for it, they raise an eyebrow. They get a little bit pissed off. I've had to fight for my medical data. And when I went from one doctor to another doctor, insisted that my medical data be provided to me as well. Now, you're often considered not a nice patient when you ask for that, but that type of language needs to be included, and people need to be encouraged to make sure they have on their computer or in their drawer hard copies or soft copies of their reports. Every report, when you go to a doctor, your blood work, your gynecological exams, any scanning, any DEX scan, any MRI, everything, you need to have a record of that. And they will not give it to you freely. In fact, they often charge for it. But if you go to the office and knock on the door and stand there, they will give it to you. So it's not easy, but I think a campaign in that direction would really benefit everyone across the board, number one. So number two, the cybersecurity. And going to Gennady, what you were talking about, protecting information and the data, I put in the discussion over here in the chat. The 15.1 billion patient records were compromised in 2018, and 270% increase over the previous year. This is not going to stop. So what is the issue here? The issue is who is dealing with cybersecurity and security threats. Once we go online, we lose our right to protection. That's just the way it is. And it's not my saying this as any theoretical concept. This is practice-based knowledge arrived at by the FBI, the CIA, and all my cybersecurity students who are diligently working to help people understand that once you plug in, once you turn on, it's there. And we do have a footprint. We have our data as a zeros and one footprint, like a carbon footprint that shows everywhere we've been. We can't stop these companies from taking our material. It's their right to do it. We go online. We've already gone into the environment. They have every right to take it. Is it nice? No. Do we prefer that they don't? Yes. So then you have to pay to have your identity protected, but still that can be hacked. So the bigger issue here goes back to the original point of this conference, which is AI collaborative. One of the core goals of AI collaborative ought to be in looking at that very issue right there. Why are we so vulnerable online, as vulnerable as we are in our biology, that any mutation, any error could occur, any error could occur at any time. And then we have to go find it. So the two areas that are comparable, kind of like eugenics and capitalism, as I spoke of in my talk, and Gennady and I spoke after my talk, we have an issue here. As you go online, anything online is open to be hacked. Your biology is open to be hacked by bacteria and viruses, et cetera. So once we look at it that way and address it as an organic system that needs to be better regulated, but not by machine ethicists, by individuals. And then you get into your body, your right, your information, your right. And maybe smarter thinkers here on the panel or later on the discussion can come up with some concept. And I think that probably Tom and David could really work well on that together and bring us up to par on strategies for the future. Thank you.
Thank you,
I
Natasha.
think that's a great point. I think that people really need to get access to their data. And I think a really cool AI project would be to equip people with an external hard drive that they could secure with their medical data, and then create AI systems where they could run it at home. They could do an analysis at home, and it would update with the best therapeutic, the best genetic information, the best, supplementing therapeutics right there on your own screen. I still am a huge advocate for sharing your data, obviously, as anonymously as possible, because that helps us build those systems. I would help an AI system build like that, but the future might be having that right secure on your own system and analyzing your own data. The outputs then would have to be pretty logical, very unbiased, and streamlined to the best science, which, and then giving you maybe some open variables of what's going on in research. So it'd be a tough problem, but that would be very cool. I mean, that really would be the future of medicine and interfacing with it.
One thing that Humanity Plus could do as a product, along with some of our product development that we're working on, is you just take a USB. Just put it in your purse, have your name on it with your personalized medicine, whatever, phrasing you want on it. And when you go, here it is. Put it on there, because they have it on their computers and they will tell you, oh, we can't find it, or our computers are backed up. No, no, no. You have to stand up for your rights as a patient. So yeah, some kind of device that could be easily inserted in a pocket that you take with you. And just when you do your appointment, I just had foot surgery. I can't walk. So every time I go to the doctor, I have x-rays. They never give me the x-rays. I want to see my x-rays. All I have to do is give them my USB. They can put it on there. So I'm someone who needs to do that myself. So I'm preaching to myself as well, but strong stance on that. Own your data.
I love the point Liz just made. I think, So I'd like to add something that after you have good results, you need to share it with the public. Okay, so yes, you keep all your private information, but once you have good results or bad results for that matter, you need to share it with other people. That way, as you collect all the information from all the private, patients in privacy.
I don't want to share my sex life, my gynecological report with anyone. Thank you very much. But
you never know.
I'll share other things.
Marriages, right? I mean, you help couples with the marriages. How to within a marriage, how to be.
Newton, you're a sweetheart. Give my love to your beautiful partner, your wife.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Dan was going to say something, so I'll mute myself.
Well, I was just going to say, I love Liz's idea. And, I work in medical imaging, and I had the exact same idea. You know what they do in medical imaging a lot in radiology is if a patient asks for it, they give it to them on a CD-ROM. That's how far behind radiology is. They don't accept USB keys. If you request your scans, you get it on a CD-ROM. And
Yeah,
then,
it's still sent to other doctors that way too. So
yeah,
yeah. Mhm.
all these systems are lagging behind. But the thing with medical images is there's often a lot of additional information in there which has not been analyzed because radiologists are so overworked. They only spend like 10 minutes looking at a scan, and there may be details in there on your fat, on bone issues that the radiologist didn't see. But if you take those, so there's a potential that you could take your scans home and have an AI system really do a thorough analysis and give you additional information that you didn't get from your doctor. And I imagine something similar might hold with genetic sequencing, or the full genome sequence. There could be AI tools where you put in your gene sequence and get much more information than you would get from just a single doctor. So, Liz, I think you really hit on a great point there, and I think that is sort of the future. It's just not fully realized yet.